Hello, I'm Mr. McMillan, and welcome to the third part of this series on the problem of evil. In this video, we will look at the Irenaean Theodicy. Just a quick reminder, a theodicy is an attempt to justify God's existence. To put it another way, it's a way of trying to show how the existence of evil and suffering is compatible with the existence of an all-loving, all-powerful God. The Irenaean Theodicy is named after the 2nd century Christian philosopher and theologian, St. Irenaeus, which is always a struggle to remember how to spell in an exam. Despite living at least a couple of centuries before St. Augustine, he always seems to come second in the textbooks, which seems to me a bit unfair, but as Irenaeus would probably say, life isn't fair. In more recent years, the Theodicy has been developed by the 20th century philosopher John Hick. Like Augustine after him, St. Irenaeus draws inspiration for his Theodicy from the book of Genesis and the creation of man. But in contrast to Augustine, he draws some significantly different conclusions. Irenaeus focuses on chapter 1 verse 26, where the author writes, "Then God said, 'Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness.'" Irenaeus interprets this to mean that there are in fact two stages to the creation of human beings. Firstly, humans are created in the image of God. This does not mean a physical image, since God is not physical, but rather means that humans share certain characteristics with God, namely that they are personal beings with consciousness, intelligence, and a moral nature. The second stage of creation is that human beings begin at birth a process of growing or developing into the likeness of God, which means transforming our moral natures to be like Him. In other words, humans are not created perfect, but rather are created with the potential to become perfect. This begs a rather obvious question: why didn't God just make us perfect in the first place? Well, Irenaeus believes that although God could have created us perfect, that morality that has been developed through hard work and the use of free will is intrinsically more valuable than a morality that has been ready-made or pre-programmed. A ready-made morality would effectively make us robots programmed to do God's will. So unlike Augustine, Irenaeus does not believe humans were made perfect. Furthermore, he does not believe that the world was made perfect either. Irenaeus believes that for humans to genuinely exercise their free will in the pursuit of moral development, then they need to live in a world where pain and suffering are real. For in a world where pain and suffering were not possible, then our actions could have no real moral consequence. For example, greeting someone by slapping them in the face would be no different to greeting them with a high five, since neither could cause any pain, distress, or upset. As Irenaeus said, a world without problems, difficulties, perils, and hardships would be morally static. For moral and spiritual growth comes through response to challenges, and in a paradise there would be no challenges. The Christian philosopher Richard Swinburne has developed this idea, trying to demonstrate that many of the moral virtues that we admire most as humans, such as compassion, generosity, and selflessness, are only necessary or even possible in a world with things like pain, poverty, and corruption. Furthermore, the value of these virtues is in equal proportion to the severity of the suffering. Real compassion is only possible when there is real pain. Real generosity is only possible when there is real poverty. And real selflessness is only possible when there is the real possibility for corruption and self-interest. The philosopher John Hick also developed the Irenaean Theodicy, and he coined the term soul-making to describe the process of moral growth. For Hick, God could intervene to prevent suffering, but this would undermine human freedom and would leave a world where there was not consistent laws of nature. Furthermore, God creates the world with himself at an epistemic distance. This rather fancy phrase just means a distance in knowledge. What he means is that God deliberately makes it so that his existence is not certain. If the opposite was true, if we could see God looking down on us at all times without any doubt of his reality, we would act morally out of a fear of judgment or punishment rather than seeking virtue for the sake of moral growth. It would be like we were living under 24-hour constant CCTV surveillance. For both Irenaeus and Hick, God allows suffering in order to lead to the higher goal of moral development or soul-making. However, it is clear that not everyone does develop morally from suffering. In fact, some people go in the opposite direction, where suffering leads not to development but moral degradation, and they become less kind, less generous, less compassionate. Irenaeus argues then, in order for the evil and suffering to be morally justified, then it must be that everyone achieves moral perfection. And therefore, since not everyone achieves it in this life, it must be the case that this process of soul-making continues after death. This is sometimes called the belief in universal salvation. In other words, everyone eventually makes it to heaven. So what are the criticisms of the Irenaean Theodicy? Again, I will consider 4 main criticisms, although more could be offered. Firstly, do the ends justify the means? In ethics, we are often told 2 wrongs don't make a right. Or to put it formally, the ends do not justify the means. In other words, it is not acceptable to do something good by doing something bad. But the Irenaean Theodicy claims that this is exactly what God does. He deliberately creates an imperfect world with suffering so that humans may morally develop. Secondly, does all suffering result in moral growth? Irenaeus seems to have an overly optimistic view of the role of suffering. Yes, some people do become better people after some period of suffering, but suffering often leads to moral degradation as often as moral development. How often do serious criminals claim that their descent into crime could be blamed on some childhood trauma? Also, can examples of indiscriminate suffering really lead to moral development? Does the stillbirth of a baby or a high school shooting really end up making the world a better place in the long run? Thirdly, is suffering the only way to create moral development? Irenaeus appears to assume that only suffering can lead to moral growth. However, there are other examples of events that could lead to an improvement in someone's character. For example, the discipline of preparing for an exam, or participating in a team sport, or learning a new skill can help develop important and valuable moral virtues. Could not God have created a world with no evil, but lots of other challenges that don't involve suffering? Finally, is universal salvation fair? Irenaeus believes that the process of soul-making continues in the afterlife, and eventually all people will make it to heaven. If this is the case, then what is the point in me being moral right now, if I can assume my soul will achieve grace in the afterlife? Do my actions now really have any consequence? Am I in fact really free to do what I want if I will eventually be forced into heaven anyway? Thanks for watching. That's the end of part 3 of this series on the problem of evil. Please make sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel, follow me on Twitter, and download the podcast from iTunes.